Chapter 9 The Race. Mandy hardly saw James for the next week. Every spare moment he could get, he spent practicing for the go-kart race. One day he came to Animal Ark to see if she would help him. "Do you want me to time you?" Mandy said. James nodded. "Down Beacon Hill," he said. "I borrowed a stopwatch from Dad." So Mandy spent the next few days timing James as he raced down Beacon Hill in Cheetah. He wasn't the only one. Andrew was there, and Peter and a few other boys, including Gary Roberts. Pam and Jill had decided to enter as well. Pam's mom was doing a night class in carpentry and had helped Pam with her go-kart. It was painted in tiger stripes and looked good. Gary's was painted to look like a snake, but Jill's looked a bit strange. It was painted to look like a car. "It was my cousin's," she explained. "I just got it yesterday. I haven't had time to paint it yet." "You don't have to," said Gary. "Just pretend it's a Jaguar." "Oh, great idea," laughed Jill. "Like a Jaguar car. I think your snake looks really good, Gary." "It's an anaconda," Gary said very proudly. The air was filled with shouts as they all raced one another again and again. "Just watch out for the river," Mandy yelled as James raced past her for a third time. "I don't want to have to fish you out." By the time the day of the picnic came, they were all in good shape, but Mandy thought James and Andrew were the best drivers. "Of course you've practiced enough," Mandy said to James as they stood at the starting line on Beacon Hill. "Grandpa says you're a great driver." James looked down at Cheetah. "It really is a terrific go-kart," he said. There was a huge banner saying Animal Antics stretched across the starting line. It had pictures of animals crawling and jumping and running in and out of the letters. The sun was shining, and Welford Village School was having the best picnic ever. Beacon Hill sloped all the way down to the bridge over the river. Andrew, Peter, and James had marked out the course for the go-kart race with colored flags on poles. "It looks really professional," Mandy said to Sarah Drummond beside her. Sarah nodded. "Just as long as nobody goes into the river," she said. "Mrs. Gardner made sure the course went in the other direction at the bottom," James said. The girls looked. The course followed the slope of the hill down to the bottom, then turned off in a wide sweep well away from the river. "Look," said Sarah. "The go-karts are starting to line up." "Better get going, James," said Amy Fenton, walking up to them. "Wish me luck," James said to Mandy. Mandy grinned. "Good luck," she said. Then Mrs. Garvey asked the racers to line up at the starting line beside their go-karts. Mandy watched as everyone stood beside their go-karts, ready to jump into them and take off as soon as Mrs. Garvey blew the whistle. The seconds stretched out, then the whistle blew, and they were off. Mandy stood at the starting line with Sarah and Amy, eyes glued to the go-karts racing down the hill. Andrew, James, and Peter were out in front, but Pam's go-kart had gathered speed and was catching up. Jill had some trouble as she and Gary veered toward each other. For a moment, it looked as if they would collide. Then Jill straightened up and shot down the hill after the leaders. James was neck and neck with Andrew now. It was hard to tell which of them was ahead. "Come on, James, come on!" Mandy yelled, jumping up and down. All around her, people were yelling their heads off as the go-karts raced down the grassy slope. First one, then another edged in front. Pam's Tiger picked up speed, threatening to overtake Kingfisher. Andrew's blue go-kart looked very impressive with its chrome wheels flashing in the sunlight. Then Cheetah came up from behind Kingfisher. "Look, James has just slipped into the lead," said Sarah. Mandy shaded her eyes from the sun to see better. "Come on, James!" she yelled again. Cheetah sped on, its wheels sparkling in the sun, covering the ground faster than before. James was going to win. He was leaving Andrew behind. Then Peter's terrier put on a sudden burst of speed and flashed past both Cheetah and Kingfisher. "Terrier in the lead!" Amy shouted. "Go for it, Peter!" But then disaster struck. Peter's go-kart went over a bump and spun around right in front of Cheetah. James swerved, just missing him. But he had lost ground, and they were almost at the finish line. Kingfisher swooped past and crossed the line in first place. The other go-karts were catching up as they swept down the hill behind James, but he managed to stay in front. James came in second, right on Andrew's heels. The watchers cheered from the hilltop. "Bad luck, James," Mandy said. "If Terrier hadn't crashed, Cheetah might have won," said Amy. "Do you think Peter is okay?" asked Mandy. Jill nodded as Peter picked himself up and waved to the crowd. "Looks like it," she said. Mandy watched them all trudge back up the hill, pulling their go-karts. They seemed to have enjoyed the race. "You did great, James," said Mandy as James came up. "I think you did really well to come in second." "So do I," said James. "I can't wait to tell your grandpa." "I won! I won!" Laura Baker shouted, running over the grass toward Mandy. Mandy looked down at the little girl. "I won the hedgehog race," said Laura. "I can roll better than anybody else." Mandy looked at the grass stains on Laura's shorts. "I can see that, Laura," she said, laughing. Sarah Drummond pushed a trolley full of packed lunches and cartons of juice over to them. "Mrs. Garvey says we can have one more race before the picnic," she said to Mandy. "What should it be?" Mandy looked at the clipboard she was holding. "The rabbit race," she said. "The rabbit race!" Laura yelled. "Wow, I bet I'll win!" And she raced off to the starting line. Mandy watched her go. Laura was full of energy. "I've brought Hoppy," said a voice beside her. Mandy looked around. Jack was standing there with Hoppy's carrier box in his arms. He opened the lid for Mandy to see. "Aw, he's lovely," said Mandy, tickling Hoppy under the chin. "And look how much he's grown!" The little rabbit twitched his ears and rubbed his nose with his tiny paws. "He can really run fast now," said Jack. "I'm sure he'll win." Mandy was puzzled. "Win what, Jack?" she said. "The rabbit race," Jack said. Mandy blinked. "But it isn't a real rabbit race," she said. "It's like all the other races. You have to pretend you're an animal and race that way." "You mean it isn't a race for rabbits?" Jack said. Mandy shook her head. "It's for people, Jack," she said. "Look." Mandy and Jack watched as Mrs. Garvey blew the whistle for the rabbit race to start. It was a sack race. The line of competitors hopped across the start, holding onto their sacks. Some of them wore silly paper rabbit ears. "Oh," said Jack. "I wondered why I couldn't see any other rabbits." Mandy bit her lip. He looked disappointed. "I'm sure if we did a real rabbit race, Hoppy would win," she said. There was a yell from the finish line, and Mandy saw Amy Fenton had thrown herself across the line just in front of Laura. When she looked up, Jack had gone. "Picnic time!" Mrs. Garvey called. Soon there was a stampede toward Sarah and the table full of goodies. Mrs. Black, James's teacher, and Mrs. Todd, Mandy's teacher, started handing out sandwiches and cartons of juice. By the time Mandy had gotten something together to eat, she had sorted out the running order of the rest of the races. She had forgotten all about Jack. She was lining people up for the snake race after lunch when the little boy appeared beside her. "Can I be in the race?" he said. "Sure," said Mandy. She looked at Hoppy. "Just make sure Hoppy is safe in his carrier box first." Jack ran off, and Mandy turned back to the children again. "You've got to wiggle," she told them. "No running, no crawling." Everyone looked up at her seriously. "How about rolling?" Laura said. "No rolling," Mandy said firmly. Mrs. Garvey put her whistle to her lips. "Ready?" she said to Mandy. Jack arrived at a run and slid down among the other competitors on the grass. "Ready," said Mandy, and Mrs. Garvey blew her whistle. Everyone started wriggling. "Look at that," said Gary Roberts. "Maybe I should have brought Gertie along after all to show them how it's done." Mandy, James, Sarah, and Andrew stood on the starting line laughing. Children were all over the place, squirming and wriggling their way all along the ground. "Look at little Susan Davis," said James. "She's gone right off the course." Mandy looked how Susan had wriggled her way right to the edge of the hill where the go-karts were parked. "Stop, Susan!" shouted Andrew. "Watch out for the carts!" Susan turned at the sound of his voice and rolled backward into Andrew's go-kart. It rocked slightly, and she put out her hand. They all watched as the go-kart slowly started to move downhill. Oh, no, said Andrew. I must have left the brake off. He ran off after his go-kart. There was a clamor of voices as people turned to look at Kingfisher rolling down the hill, starting to go faster. Then a terrified voice shouted over the others. Hoppy! Jack yelled. Mandy spun around as the little boy jumped to his feet and began to run after the go-kart. Jack? What is it? She yelled, running after him. Jack didn't stop. I put Hoppy in that go-kart, he panted as he ran. I thought he would be safe. Mandy looked at the go-kart racing down the hill, heading straight for the river. James! She screamed. We must catch the cart. James was already racing toward her, but she couldn't stop. If anything happened to this pet, Jack would never be brave enough to get another. Jack was fighting back tears. He'll be killed, won't he said as he stumbled across the grass. If the go-kart goes into the river, Hoppy will drown.